Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to get into something pretty interesting,
Yeah.
Black patriotism in America.
Yeah.
And we've got this great article here that we're going to be taking a look at titled Debating Patriotism, the Challenges Black Americans Face in Expressing Patriotism in America.
Mm.
We talk a lot about patriotism in our everyday lives, but what does it mean when we look at it from this particular lens?
Well, I think it adds a whole other layer of complexity to it, honestly.
Yeah.
We're looking at what does it mean to love and belong to a country that historically hasn't loved you back?
Right, and before we get into all of that nuance, what are we even talking about when we say patriotism?
Yeah, so, I mean, at its core, it's that feeling that you have, that connection and pride, that sense of loyalty that you feel to your particular nation.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be something as simple as displaying a flag, or it can be something as deep as feeling like you have a duty to make your country better.
Right, like rooting for Team USA at the Olympics or, volunteering in your community. Yeah. But the article seems to say that it goes a little bit deeper than that. Yeah. What do you think?
Absolutely. And it can also be a way of saying, I love my country so much that I want to call out the things that I think are wrong with it.
Uh-huh.
I want it to live up to those ideals that it purports to have.
Yeah, and so how does this specifically play out then when we're looking at the Black American experience? I mean, was there a sense of patriotism during slavery when basic human rights were denied?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to grapple with that question. If you are told that you are not fully human, if you are denied basic rights, but you live in a country that says it's the land of the free, where does that leave you?
Right.
Where does that leave you in terms of patriotism?
Yeah, was there any form of patriotism that we can see during that time?
It might not be the flag-waving kind of patriotism, but I think there is a different kind of love for a country that emerges.
Mm-hmm.
And we see this during the Civil War when Black men enlisted to fight for a country that had enslaved them.
Right. And I think that begs the question, were they really fighting for a country that they believed in, or were they fighting out of a need for survival?
Yeah.
What were figures like Frederick Douglass saying at the time?
Well, Douglass was saying that he really saw Black enlistment as a way to prove their loyalty. He saw it as a way to earn their emancipation.
Okay.
But he also saw it as a way to force America to finally recognize Black men as citizens and as men.
Hmm.
So it's a very interesting way of sort of conceptualizing this kind of patriotism that we're talking about here.
And then immediately after the Civil War, we have this moment of Reconstruction, but it falls apart, and we enter this period of Jim Crow, of segregation. How did this period, which is essentially a betrayal of everything that the Civil War was supposed to stand for, how did that impact Black patriotism?
I mean, imagine putting your life on the line and fighting for a country.
Right.
Only to be told that you're still not good enough.
Right.
That you still don't belong here. It's enough to make anyone cynical.
Yeah.
But yet, I think it's in this time period that we really see the resilience of Black Americans and their concept of patriotism.
Right.
They don't give up on the dream of America.
Right. And we see this with Dr. King, with Martin Luther King Jr., where he is both fiercely critical of the country, but also believes in it deeply. And I think he really forces us to ask the question, can you truly love a country without at the same time demanding it be better?
Exactly. And this isn't just something from the past. We see this question pop up all the time in our contemporary moment.
Yeah.
Athletes and artists are dealing with this question all the time. Activists are.
And speaking of the contemporary moment, let's talk about systemic racism.
Yeah.
We're talking about things like economic disparities, lack of education opportunities, the disproportionate incarceration rate of Black men in America. How does that impact and shape feelings of patriotism?
Yeah, I mean, just imagine this. Imagine trying to buy a home.
Yeah.
But you find out that you can't buy a home in certain neighborhoods because of racist housing policies.
Yeah.
That's redlining.
Right.
And that is something that has had such a legacy. It impacts the ability of Black families to gain wealth today.
Right.
And then, on top of that, think about being denied loans, being discriminated against when you apply for jobs.
Yeah.
Think about your community being over-policed. These are the realities of systemic racism that Black Americans face every day.
And I think that really begs the question, how can you feel any patriotism when you're faced with this kind of reality?
Yeah.
But at the same time, Black Americans have contributed so much to this country.
Absolutely.
And continue to be incredibly resilient.
Yeah. I think a lot of Black Americans feel pride in their heritage, pride in their community.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they recognize that they have been marginalized.
Yeah.
So it's this sort of duality that they're constantly grappling with.
So how does that duality play out? How does that shape how Black Americans express their patriotism?
Well, I think that's when we get into these contemporary expressions of Black patriotism that I was talking about earlier.
Right.
And that's a story of defiance and a story of hope. And it's a conversation I think we need to be having.
Okay, so let's talk about these contemporary expressions of Black patriotism that you were mentioning. It seems like we're moving from a place of pain and struggle to a place where hope and resilience are at the forefront.
I think that's a good way of putting it, yeah. It's really about rewriting the script and reclaiming that narrative in many ways.
And the article talks about military service, and that's always been something that I found really interesting. Despite everything that we've talked about, Black Americans continue to enlist at very high rates in the military.
Right.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's a question that we need to be asking more. You know, to serve a country that hasn't always served you, I think speaks to a deeply held belief in those founding ideals of justice and equality and opportunity for all, and a commitment to fight for those things, even when they aren't fully realized.
It's like they're saying, this is my country and I'm going to fight for it, even though it's not perfect.
Exactly.
And it's not just about defending borders. It's really about defending the very soul of what America stands for and pushing America to be better.
Absolutely.
And then we have Black culture. Which is so interwoven with the fabric of America.
Right.
How does that play into patriotism? I mean, it's a little bit different from waving a flag, but does that make it any less patriotic?
No. I think in some ways it's even more powerful, you know, celebrating Black identity, giving voice to those struggles, but also to those joys.
Yeah.
Challenging norms. That's powerful. I mean, think about the music of Beyonce and Kendrick Lamar. They don't shy away from these tough conversations about race and inequality in this country.
It's a form of protest, a way of holding up a mirror to society and demanding change. This is the reality, and we're not going to be silent about it.
Exactly.
And it really sparks dialogue, doesn't it? It forces us to confront these things and to maybe look at them in a different way.
Right.
And speaking of pushing the culture forward, we can't forget about movements like Black Lives Matter. How does that play into this conversation?
I think Black Lives Matter is really patriotism in action. It's about demanding justice and equality and accountability from a nation that you love.
Right.
It's challenging that systemic racism.
It's saying we love this country so much that we're willing to fight for its soul, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's painful.
Exactly. It's a belief in the promise of a better America.
Okay, so the article also talks about the celebration of Black history.
Yes.
How does understanding Black history help us understand American history as a whole? It feels like they're inextricably linked.
They are completely linked. I mean, Black history is American history. And so much of the time, we don't see it that way, right? But it is about understanding the contributions and the sacrifices and the struggles that have shaped this nation.
It's like we're only seeing half the tapestry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when we add all of those threads in, we get a richer and a more complete picture of what it means to be American. And I think that understanding can lead to a better and more nuanced form of patriotism.
And this leads me to the role of education, which the article highlights as being really key in shaping how we think about patriotism, especially for Black Americans. How does the education that you receive in schools differ from the education that you receive maybe outside of the classroom, in the community?
It's about whose stories we're telling and how we're telling them. You know, traditional education is very focused on a specific narrative. And often that narrative doesn't include the full spectrum of Black experiences.
So it's like we're getting an incomplete picture.
Exactly. But then you go outside of the classroom and within Black communities, there's a different type of education going on. There's that education that's passed down from generation to generation through family stories and community gatherings.
It's a living history. It's a history of resistance and resilience that's passed down from people who actually lived it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that shapes a very different kind of understanding of what it means to be both Black and American.
Right.
A different understanding of patriotism.
And that leads me to the idea of having more honest and open conversations about race and patriotism.
Yes.
How do we bridge that gap between what's being taught in schools and what's actually being lived by Black Americans?
Well, I think we have to first acknowledge that that gap exists.
Right.
And we have to create spaces where those different perspectives can be shared and can be discussed openly.
Okay.
And those conversations need to happen everywhere.
Right.
They need to happen in classrooms. They need to happen in community centers.
Right, yeah.
They need to happen around the dinner table.
It feels like we need to have a more inclusive definition of what it means to be American that takes into account all the different experiences and contributions of all Americans.
Absolutely. And so I think that's where this conversation about redefining patriotism comes into play. How do we create a more equitable and inclusive vision of what it means to love this country?
Okay, so we've talked about the complexities, we've talked about the challenges, but how do we actually move forward? How do we redefine patriotism in a way that feels inclusive and honest, a patriotism that really speaks to everybody in this country?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And the article gives us some really good places to start.
Okay.
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that it can't just be about symbolic gestures.
Right.
We have to actually put in the work to make those changes.
So are we talking about systemic change then? Addressing the underlying causes of inequality that we were talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think policy change is a big part of that.
Okay, so what kind of policies are we talking about?
Well, think about education, for example. Right now, Black history is often relegated to a single month out of the year.
Right.
We really need to be integrating Black history into our curriculum year-round.
Right, so we're getting a fuller picture.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just history class, too. Systemic racism impacts every facet of life.
Right.
It impacts housing, it impacts healthcare, it impacts the criminal justice system. So we need policies that are going to address those inequalities.
And the article also talks about the importance of community initiatives.
Yeah.
What role do those play in redefining patriotism?
I think community initiatives are really about building bridges across those racial and cultural divides. Think about things like cultural festivals or community dialogues or neighborhood projects that can bring people together.
Yeah, it's about creating those spaces where people can come together, have conversations, and maybe see the world from a different perspective.
Yeah, right.
Because patriotism doesn't have one face.
It means something different to everyone.
And we need to celebrate that diversity of expression. The article also points to the importance of media representation.
Right.
How Black Americans are portrayed in movies and in TV shows and in books. That all shapes how people view Black Americans.
So we need more Black storytellers. We need more diverse narratives to really combat those harmful stereotypes and to show the richness of the Black experience.
Exactly. I think we really need to be working towards reflecting the reality of America in all its diversity.
So where does this leave us? What can we as individuals actually do to contribute to this new vision of patriotism?
I think it starts with education. Educate yourself about the history and the experiences of Black Americans. Be open to having those uncomfortable conversations about race and racism.
Listen to Black voices. Amplify those voices.
Exactly. And be an ally, not just with your words, but with your actions.
And I think it's about challenging ourselves, too. Challenging our own biases and our own assumptions. Right. Because patriotism isn't about blind allegiance. It's really about holding our country accountable to those ideals and pushing it to be better.
It's about understanding that loving your country doesn't mean ignoring its flaws. It means working to make it a better place for everyone.
This has been a really great conversation. Black patriotism is complex. It's a story of struggle and resilience.
Yeah.
And it's a story of hope. And it really challenges us to confront those uncomfortable truths about our history. But it also gives us a vision for the future, a vision of a more inclusive and equitable America for everyone. I want to leave you with this thought. How can we in our own lives contribute to a more inclusive and equitable understanding of what it means to be a patriot in this country?
It's a tough question, but it's one that we need to keep asking ourselves and keep working towards answering. Thank you so much for listening to this deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.